Well, we've made it to our last lecture of the second book, America's Unwritten Constitution. I'm going to have one wrap-up lecture for the course as a whole, but let's, before we get to the course as a whole, let's just continue our conversation about the Constitution of the future, about the Constitution still to be written. What should the 28th Amendment look like, and the 29th, and what will these amendments look like if we're trying to make predictions? And my claim is that in America, ours is a fundamental federal system in which states road test all sorts of ideas that then the federal Constitution sort of emulates. It sits atop these state laboratories of experimentation. We've identified 10 fundamental ways in which the U.S. constitutional systems, the American systems, all 51, state constitutions and the federal, are very similar to each other and differ from at least one major foreign constitutional democracy, Great Britain or Italy or France or Germany or Israel or Australia or India. But what's really amazing is within each of the similarities we've identified, there's also a difference between state practice and the federal practice. And so this creates a set of interesting questions. Should states change their way of doing things? Should the federal government change their way of doing things? Or is it just right as is because actually on some things you want the federal and the state constitutions to diverge a bit? So what was the first similarity? We have 51 written constitutions that all emerge from some special expression of popular sovereignty. Again, that's not true in England or in Israel. But here's the difference. State constitutions generally are much longer and much easier to amend than the federal Constitution. So that raises a question. And in many state constitutions, by the way, when you amend the Constitution, you don't add an amendment to the end. You just reword process the document. You sort of rewrite the initial document. But the big question is, should the federal Constitution be easier to amend, to look more like the states? Should state constitutions to be harder to amend, to look more like the feds? Or are we already in sort of in the Goldilocks world where we're just right? Well, I used to think when I was a young man, and that's the question, and we can debate that. But we now have a good issue to focus on when we see the difference between state constitutions and the federal. Now, when I was a young guy, I said, gee, federal constitution's too difficult to amend. Things could be so much better. Lots of good proposals are getting dinged. Now that I'm older, I think, yeah, it could be a lot better. But it could be a lot worse. And there were a bunch of bad proposals in my lifetime to criminalize flag burning and to constitutionalize, one man, one woman marriage, all sorts of stuff. And they didn't pass. So yes, the bar is raised pretty high, but isn't it interesting? Almost all the bad proposals have failed. The amendments that have cleared the bar, interesting, almost all of them have added to liberty and equality. They've actually improved our system. Our amendments have made amends. Pretty impressive. I don't think I can say that about state constitutions. State constitutions are easy to amend. They've had some good amendments, lots of bad amendments too, and they've gone back and forth. The federal constitutional system has been a little bit steadier. One genuinely failed amendment, prohibition, and the system was flexible enough to actually get rid of it when it proved itself to be suboptimal. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th. But with the benefit of more study of the matter, it actually seems to me pretty impressive. I now think that it's pretty impressive that the amendments have generally improved things at the federal level. Here's a story about maybe why it's just right, as is. So you might say, well, should state constitutions therefore be harder to amend on the federal model? Maybe we're in a world that's just right. The federal Constitution, which is pretty hard to amend, creates a very stable framework with a safety net beneath all the states. They can't go below federal standards of Republican government and privileges and immunities. So we've got a secure, hard-to-amend federal safety net. And above that, states can actually experiment pretty easily and generate all sorts of interesting reform ideas. And if state constitutions were too hard to amend, then maybe we'd have less experimentation, and experimentation is useful for sister states to possibly copy and eventually for the federal government to consider. So maybe we actually have the best of all possible worlds. A stable federal constitution and a more fluid state constitutional laboratories experimentation. At least Wouldn't that be nice if that were so? Again, I'm not so much insisting that you agree or disagree, but these are the questions I want you to think about when you look at all 51 constitutions, state and federal. State bills of rights, very similar to the federal Bill of Rights, but state bills, and a lot of overlap of substance. They all talk about free speech, free press, free exercise, and so on. But state constitutions sometimes have more affirmative rights in them, rights of education and positive social rights. And so we could ask, well, has that state experiments guaranteeing affirmative rights, like public education, been a great success that the federal Constitution should copy? Has it been a failure? If the federal Constitution should copy state constitutions in protecting more affirmative rights like education, should that be done by reinterpreting the existing federal Constitution or by adding a formal constitutional amendment? Third, a lot of states have term limits for legislatures. Federal Constitution doesn't. Are term limits a good idea? Should the federal government go with term limits? Should states abandon them? Here's very interesting. We can actually compare states with term limits to states without and see which might be better. Some states have initiative and referendum and recall. The federal Constitution doesn't have these. So have these experiences been, at the state level, been happy ones, worthy of federal emulation, or maybe not so much? How about, here's a big difference. Yes, states have bicameral legislatures, but their upper houses are proportionate. They're not malapportioned. They're based on population. No state has a state senate in which unequally populous counties have the same number of seats, like the U.S. Senate, where unequally populous states, Wyoming and California, have the same number of seats, two apiece. So Reynolds versus Sims, this Warren Court case that we talked about, imposed a one-person, one-vote proportionality idea on both houses of the state legislature. Is that something that the federal Constitution should emulate? And if it should, how would we ever get there? Why would Wyoming ever agree to a federal constitutional amendment that gave California way more seats than Wyoming? I'm going to come back to that question. If term limits are a good idea, why would current federal Congress people ever agree to a federal amendment with federal term limits? So one of the ideas is, even if you've identified an interesting reform possibility, how would you actually ever get there if some of these reforms might be contrary to the interests of current institutions and actors who could block possible reforms? Again, I'm going to come back to that at the very end. Note that each state basically picks each state has a governor who looks like a mini president, typically a 4-year term, except I think in New Hampshire and Vermont, and veto pen and pardon pen. But note that states directly elect their governors. We don't do that for the U.S. president. Here's another possible sort of reform idea that we talked about before. A directly elected president would make presidents look like governors. It's not a foreign idea. It's not like proportional representation or a multi-party system. These might be good ideas. These might not be good ideas, proportional representation, multi-party system, but they're not American ideas. Directly electing your chief executive, one person, one vote, is an American idea. It's how every state does it. That's why electoral college reform is kind of plausible to imagine. It's just because deeply intuitively you see how states do it. And they're picking people who look like presidents, who often run for president, Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter or Mitt Romney or Mike Dukakis or George W. Bush. Ronald Reagan. Governors become presidents. As governors, they look like presidents, and they're not picked by electoral colleges. So that's a possible reform. The idea that governors don't have to be natural-born citizens, that suggests this other possible federal reform, that naturalized citizens maybe should be eligible one day to the presidency. Now, we talked about how lieutenant governors look a lot like vice presidents, but in many states you can vote separately for governor and lieutenant governor. But ordinarily, you can't split your ticket between president and vice president. So should that be a possible reform? Unlike the U.S. Supreme Court, a lot of state Supreme Courts actually are, even though we have judicial review that looks very similar between the state and the federal system, and state courts enforce state constitutions in a way similar to the way the U.S. Courts enforce the U.S. Constitution, but some state courts can issue what are called advisory opinions. They can hear lawsuits even before the law goes into effect. Massachusetts has a system of advisory opinions. Some other states do. Should the U.S. court system, in particular the Supreme Court, be more open to the idea, should it have an advisory opinion system? And if so, should we get there by a formal constitutional amendment of the federal system or by reinterpretation of the words of Article 3? What about judicial tenure? No state except Rhode Island has a system of life tenure. So should the states actually move to the federal model? Should the federal model move to the states? Maybe actually both have gotten it wrong. In a lot of states, the judicial selection is perhaps too political, with people running for judicial office in partisan elections. They call themselves Democrats or Republicans, with lots of money being spent. Maybe that's an okay way to pick legislators, but not judges, because judges should be evaluated by whether they're actually interpreting the law, and that's a hard thing for voters to know unless they know a lot about the lawsuits themselves, and it's very hard that ordinary voters could do that. So maybe the states aren't picking judges the right way, but maybe life tenure isn't the right way of doing things at the federal model. Maybe we should actually have some sort of hybrid. 18 years, for example, of service. And maybe, and then if you're a Supreme Court justice, you after 18 years, you sit on some other federal court or something rather than being on the Supreme Court for life. But the fact that no state emulates, except Rhode Island, the life tenure model of Article 3 suggests that that's a possible area of future reform, and that wouldn't look un-American to, say, move from life tenure to an 18-year term or a 15-year term in some states. Some states have mandatory retirement of judges at certain ages, 70 or 75. Now, excuse me, state constitutions, when a state Supreme Court construes the state constitution and the people don't like it, that's easier to overturn than at the federal constitutional level, where if the U.S. Supreme Court interprets the U.S. Constitution and people don't like it, it's harder to overturn that. So this is a reminder, perhaps, that courts themselves, the U.S. Supreme Court, should be particularly open to rethinking erroneous precedents because it's so hard for the people themselves to overturn an erroneous precedent. We talked about how a lot of how the states have a jury system, just like the federal Constitution has a jury system. But in a lot of states, the jury doesn't need to be unanimous, or at least in some states it doesn't. Should that be a model for federal emulation? We talked about that, whether we should insist on jury unanimity on the criminal side. A bunch of states do not have grand juries that are required in order to commence a criminal prosecution for a serious offense. If grand jury is such a good idea, why shouldn't all the states adopt it? And if actually the states shouldn't all adopt it because it's not such a good idea, should we stick with it at the federal level? So, a series of interesting reform questions, an agenda for future scholarly research and for public comment and conversation when we carefully compare the 50 state constitutions to the federal Constitution. Now here's what I want to end with. Some of the reform ideas that we've been thinking about are not necessarily in the interest of current powerful institutions that might have the ability to block these amendments. Suppose you thought term limits actually was a good idea. States had done it very well, and we should have that at the federal level. Or we should have recall elections. You think they've worked well at the state level, and you'd like to see it at the federal level. But would Congress do this? Make their own office is less secure through term limits or through the possibility of recall. Suppose you think that actually the U.S. Senate is malapportioned, that states are better because their upper houses aren't malapportioned. But why would Wyoming ever agree to an amendment that changed the rules of U.S. Senate apportionment? So aren't we just, and in particular when it comes to the Senate malapportionment, doesn't every state have to agree? Because there's a rule in the Constitution that no state can be deprived of its equal seats in the Senate without its own consent. Doesn't that require every single state to agree? Well, in fact, that's not the problem with the Senate. Because you could have a 28th Amendment that reads as follows. All the powers currently given to the U.S. Senate shall hereinafter be vested in a new upper house. All powers currently vested in the U.S. Senate, except for the power to try the impeachments of Assistant Postmaster General, shall be relocated into a new upper house. So you keep the Senate for a small set of functions. Everything else you give to a new upper house, and that upper house shall be apportioned as follows. And that's just an ordinary amendment. It doesn't require every state to say yes, because you haven't changed the apportionment rules of the Senate. You've just taken a lot of the powers of the Senate and given it to a new body. So it doesn't require every state to agree, but it does require 2/3 of the existing House to agree. 2/3 of the existing Senate, including Wyoming equally with California, to agree. 3/4 of the states to sign on, including Wyoming counting equally with California. For every Wyomingian, I think there are 80 Californians. Wyoming is about 500,000. California is about 40 million. But Wyoming counts equally in the amendment process, both in the Senate, where it has to pass by 2/3, and in the ratification process, 3/4. Why would Wyoming ever agree to an amendment that, for example, said this new upper house is going to every state gets at least one person. No state has more than 8. But California will have 8 senators in effect and Wyoming only 1. Why would Wyoming ever agree to that? Why would existing congressmen ever agree to term limits or to the possibility of recall? Aren't we just sort of doomed to this system, even if it's not right and not fair? I want to end by saying, no, we're not doomed. I want you to think about what the world should look like, not just in 2020, but 21, 21, 22, 22. And I want you to think in particular about the following possible kind of amendment. Let's call it a sunrise amendment. You think about sunset legislation. Legislation, you pass it and it expires after a certain number of years, the Bush tax cuts or something. The standing Army appropriation sunsets. It lapses every 2 years. It needs to be revoted on. But now instead think about a sunrise law, a law that basically doesn't go into operation until 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 50 years from now. Now, when we're talking about ordinary elections for lawmakers, it would be ridiculous to say, well, we vote now, and the person who wins takes office in 50 years. That'd be an Alice in the Wonderland world. Or for ordinary laws, we vote now, but these laws go into effect in 50 years. For ordinary laws, that wouldn't be so sensible. For constitutional provisions, maybe this idea is a sensible idea. Constitution is over the long run. What are just and fair rules for societal governance? If we can think back 225 years, we should think forward and think we can be the framers of the future. So now, let's think about you're a Wyoming senator, and your name is Jefferson Smith. That's the character played by Jimmy Stewart in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And and if you vote to amend the Senate today, you're out of a job, you're unlikely to do that. But now instead, the question is, what should the Senate look like 50 years from now, 100 years from now? You're going to be dead. Your great-grandchildren are going to be alive. They're not even born yet. But your great-grandchildren, are they going to be Wyomingians? Maybe they're more likely to be Californians or New Yorkers. Why should you favor your Wyoming grandchildren over your California grandchildren? If you believe that a more proportional Senate would actually be more fair, more just to posterity, you can focus on just the issue of fairness behind what the famous philosopher John Rawls called a veil of ignorance, a generational veil of ignorance. You don't know whether your unborn great-grandchildren are going to be gay or straight, or rich or poor, or whether they're going to be New Yorkers or Wyoming people. So your task is to think about what would be a fair ground rules for the future. You can be, we can be, my fellow Americans, founders of the future with the idea of a sunrise amendment. This is actually an idea that, if we read carefully, is already in the existing Constitution, but they didn't use it enough. Slavery was wrong. They understood that slavery was wrong. And in one little corner, but it was part of their way of life, the founding. And in one little corner, they said, here's what we can do. We can say slavery now of a certain sort, but not in the future. What they said is the international slave trade, kidnapping free-born blacks in Africa and transporting them across the Atlantic, that slave trade needs to keep going for 20 years because South Carolina insists on it and Georgia insists on it. But in 1808, we can end it. A sunrise amendment, or sunrise provision. Now, what they didn't do is say, in 1808, not just the international slave trade must end. They just said it can end, but they didn't say it must end. And they didn't say in 1808, not only must the international slave trade end, slavery itself must end, or slavery in the West must be prohibited, or the 3/5 clause must end in must end in 1808. And the numbers can be negotiated. They could have said in 1876. But they used this sunrise idea in one small place. They basically said, today we have to compromise with evil because it's part of our way of life. There are people who are benefiting from it. We can't pull the rug out from under them. They didn't invent the system. They inherited it, but it's their way of life. But the future should be better. We should give our unborn great-grandchildren a better system. You see glimmers of that with the 1808 provision, but I suggest it could be generalized. So I end with this thought that, once again, if you've been with me this far in this course, and thank you very much, by the way, for sticking with me this far, we've talked a lot about stuff that happened 150 years ago, the Civil War, and 225 years ago, the hinge of human history, the year that changed everything, 1787, 88. We need to think as seriously about what the world should look like 150 years from now, 225 years from now. We can be framers of the future. And we can do this with sunrise amendments that don't kick in today, but that will only be activated in the future. And we can kind of ask ourselves, we might still disagree, but we can ask ourselves not what's in it for us, what advances our interest, but what is just and fair for our posterity, not knowing whether my unborn great-grandchildren are going to be, as I said, rich or poor, or New Yorkers or Wyomingians, or gay or straight. What would be fair terms for our posterity? So let me actually just read you the last paragraph of the last chapter of the book, and then I'm going to come back with one final sort of lecture about the course as a whole. And of course, I have to tell you about this picture. Here's the last paragraph of the book, of the last chapter. Faithful constitutionalists labor under a twofold constitutional responsibility. We must look backward in time and claim our constitutional inheritance, and we must also look forward in time and make our constitutional donation. Though this second responsibility does not reside on the clear surface of any explicit constitutional text, surely it forms an integral part of America's unwritten Constitution. So in other words, so much of American constitutional law remains to be written. You can be founders of the future. I want you to take in this picture. This is from about 1970. These are women demanding equality, taking to the streets. Their grandmothers had given us the 19th Amendment, had taken to the streets. They are taking to the streets again. They're in support of things like the Equal Rights Amendment. But that story isn't over. The question is, what should the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, our generation, your generation of Americans, how should we actually carry forward this great intergenerational project that is America's Constitution? Okay, I'm going to, basically we've covered the 2 books. I'm going to have one final lecture trying to sort of pull the course together a little bit for you. So I hope you stay with me for that. Thanks.